Today we will embark on the most contentious thing you can do in the Genshin Impact space. We are doing the official 5.3 Jello Impact Power Rankings tier list. I have not only tested every single unit on this list, I have conversed at great length with other content creators, theory crafters, and meta players, so although I can guarantee that you will not agree with a lot that is on this list, it is accurate to the best of my ability given the criteria that I will lay out. If you have serious disagreements and can back up your claims, feel free to message me on Discord, as I am very serious about making the best Genshin Impact tier list possible. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. The Spiral Abyss is the main criteria that we will be using to judge the units, not just the current Spiral Abyss, but the previous 6 to 9 months of Spiral Abysses that we've had, as well as the projected future trend of future Spiral Abysses, so that ideally the tier list will age relatively well, that characters won't fluctuate hugely based on changing content, and will only fluctuate based on actual meta shifts, not each individual Spiral Abyss. We'll be considering 5-star units at Constellation 0 with their signature weapon, or Constellation 1 with a 4-star weapon if that is significantly better. I believe that most people concerned with meta tier lists are willing to invest at the bare minimum either a weapon or an early constellation into their DPS, as is almost always great value to do so. If you believe a free-to-play tier list with C0, R0 weapons makes more sense, that's your prerogative. This is what I've chosen to go with. We are ranking on-fielders and off-fielders in 2 separate lists. The off-field 5-stars will be considered C0, R0 because it's generally better to invest in a weapon or constellation for your DPS as opposed to your off-fielder. 4-star units are considered at C6, and if they're a DPS, we will consider them with a 5-star weapon to keep things fair. I do understand that for new players, or for all players with new 4-stars, that C6 is very unattainable. And so 4-stars will be marked with their constellation number in the corner to indicate that they would go down a tier or more if they did not have that specified constellation. The priorities for judgment for this tier list are threefold. Number 1, power, a unit's ability to perform on and contribute to strong teams. Notice they need to be on a strong team and contribute to the strong team. Number 2, flexibility. This is a unit's ability to contribute to both a variety of different teams, in case you don't have just one set of units, as well as teams that can perform various checks, such as AoE, single target, multi-target, multi-wave, type checks, shield breaking, etc. 3, comfort and ease of use, a unit's ability to perform on and contribute to teams that the majority of players can find easy enough or comfortable enough to play and get relatively consistently good results. So a tier 0 unit will be all 3. They'll contribute greatly to a wide variety of powerful teams that can perform a variety of checks, and will be easy enough to use for most players to get consistently good results. As we go down the tier list, characters will make various concessions that make them worse in some of those areas. Here are the different tiers. We've got our on-field and main DPS side, as well as our off-field side. We've got different lines denotating what general area that the characters reside. Tier 5 for DPSs, we have Hydro Traveler, Electro Traveler, Aloy, Amber, Kaveh, and Shenhe. Basically, aside from Plunge, these characters are simply not able to clear without extreme investment, extreme creativity, and extreme dedication. These are not ordered in the way of worst to best. If anything, they're almost reverse ordered. Hydro Traveler, arguably the worst unit in the entire game, doing basically nothing, and all of these kits have just aged extremely poorly. On the support side, we have Amber and Aloy. Yes, we are considering some characters in both the DPS and the off-field side of things, but unfortunately in the case of Amber and Aloy, they are both very bad at both. In tier 4, we have Eula. Now, I actually think that Eula could one day become a pretty good character, actually. I think that Genshin has been very, very ridiculously stingy about releasing anything in the way of physical support, and for Eula, it just shows very clearly. She has some problems with her kit, to be sure, the backloaded damage, the burst having an absolutely crazy energy cost, but her biggest problem is the lack of synergy, and this is all Hoyoverse's fault. She does physical damage, but wants to be played with Electro and Cryo teams. Well, there aren't any Electro or Cryo characters that actually buff physical damage, so you basically need to run her with off-fielders. But there's no way to buff both Electro and Cryo damage on one team, so no matter what you do, you're running subpar synergies. And the superconduct reaction alone, although not bad, isn't enough to carry her. Units these days have extremely fleshed out supports, off-field DPS, and there is plenty of room for Eula to be an actual decent character in the future, but right now it's extremely difficult to clear with her, so she's here in tier 4. Heizo is a character that basically just suffers from lower multipliers. Yes, you can run him as a DPS with Faruzan. Yes, you can run him as a driver for Taser, but neither are particularly strong. And although, yes, tier 4 is viable-ish, whereas tier 5 I would consider unviable, he just doesn't contribute enough. Most people are going to have a very hard time clearing with DPS Heizo, and yeah, there's some aggravate stuff, but Hoyoverse just really kind of neutered him with very, very weak auto attacks, and his big skill nuke just isn't as impressive as it used to be. Razor is here mostly because you can use him as Burgeon / Hyperbloom Razor, and it is something that you can still do. However, the reaction isn't quite enough to carry him into the higher tiers. It's still like a viable-ish thing you can do. I would call tier 4 viable-ish. Back in Sumeru, this was actually quite viable. Enemies were pretty close together, and Burgeon's AoE was very relevant, and the DPS checks and the overall expectation for how much damage that teams could do was a lot lower, and Razor unfortunately just hasn't gotten any new tools since then, so although he's still viable-ish, not as high, I think tier 4 is the right place. Ningguang teams have made it out of the basement with Shalonen. Granted, she is Omega carried by usually going to be using Farina, Yelan, Shalonen, and the team feels not bad. You can also swap Yelan for Bennett, and she does not bad damage, but of course it is the other teams that are carrying her. She just doesn't contribute all that much to that team, but I'm happy. Honestly, I think tier 4 is a win. I'm happy to see her out of tier 5, which is where she would have been before Shalonen. The final character in this tier is Fremine. Very similar to Eula, there's just not much going for physical right now. He does have a bit more consistency than Eula, but he also needs to trigger Shatter to activate his full kit, so there goes the consistency right there. You can't trigger Shatter versus bosses. Overall, I can definitely see Fremine going up in the future with more physical support. I think Fremine and Eula have the most potential in this tier to go up in the future. On the off-field side, starting with Dendro Traveler. And no, I don't have anything wrong with Lumine, but I took these screenshots from my actual account, and of course I chose Aether, so all of the screenshots are Aether. But Dendro Aether, like, he does apply Dendro, but applying Dendro isn't what it used to be. Just applying Dendro doesn't all of a sudden make you a top meta team, but it is something. Kind of like how Animo allowing you to swirl with VV doesn't just make you a good unit anymore, but it is still something, so in the viable-ish tier. Chi-Chi being a team-wide healer kind of allows her to be in the viable-ish tier, as she can heal for Farina teams, but what we expected of healers is a lot more than what Chi-Chi provides these days. She has huge uptime issues, she provides no energy, she just really has nothing going for her at all. Very sad. Jinyan has supportive things she can do as a support because she can provide off-field pyro, which is good for things like Chevris and Mualani, and she provides a shield, but unfortunately her pyro app stops if her shield breaks. So it's just unreliable, and I don't really recommend people do it, but it is viable-ish. Dory can also be a viable-ish healer, but there's not that much need for an off-field electro healer. You can do some Hyperbloom stuff, but it's janky and just in general not reliable. Dory does have a good use, but that's going to be in the DPS side. So that's tier 4. Tier 3, we're going to do the slow reveal. Again, this is not ordered. Noelle, she definitely got a buff with Shalonen teams, Farina Yelan, but generally speaking, it is more of the good team carrying her. And I would say all of tier 3, there is a pretty decent gap between tier 3 and tier 4 and 5. You know what? All right, so I've added little things. We've got the Madman line. If you're going to use these characters, you're a madman, even if you're a woman. Viable-ish if you work hard line. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And then this is the carried but viable line. Units below this line are considered carried by their teammates to clear more than they are contributing to the team themselves. But it's important to note, still viable. Dory. She can be your Hyperbloom, Quick Bloom kind of character, or an Aggravate driver, and Dory's actually viable in that. Those teams aren't as good as they used to be, but still totally doable. Yanfei can actually get some pretty solid clears. I like using Yanfei. She's sort of easier to use yoimiya, actually has some AoE, has a built-in shield, not quite as high single target damage, got a nice buff from Novalet's weapon, carried but viable. Sethos is a weird one. His sheets are some of the highest, well, maybe not the highest anymore, but his sheets, theory crafting wise, are technically very, very high, very, very impressive. And yes, mine is not fully ascended, but I tested him extensively when I had access to the creator server, and that was level 90 with crown talents. But he's very tricky to play. He's very weird to play. I don't see very many people actually using Sethos and getting good clears. I think it's technically possible, but for most players, which again is part of our criteria, they're not going to be getting great clears with Sethos. And he's got very weird walk cancel combos, and it's just things that most people aren't going to be doing. So I'm sure there's some crazy people that can put Sethos higher on the tier list, but for most players, this is where he's going to go. He feels about as good as the other aggravate carries like Keqing and Dori. Chongyun has some reasonably good melt stuff, especially with Xilonen. He got some improvements, but as with most cryos, falls a bit short of really pushing the higher limits. Keqing has some really nice AoE from her burst. She's very quick swappy, reasonably comfy, and is a pretty good aggravate carry. Aggravate isn't great right now. It hasn't received any new tools for a very long time. Xilonen does help, but aggravate was also best in AoE and groupable AoE with Kazuha, and that was one of Keqing's best things. So until we get that sort of groupable AoE that Keqing was really, really good in, or we get some dedicated aggravate buffers, which I think could happen, she's going to stay here. But I really think that Keqing, Sethos, Dori, I think that aggravate could get a really big buff in the future with some sort of dedicated aggravate character. So I definitely see future stonks for Keqing, Sethos, and Dori, but for now she's going to be in tier 3. Tighnari, similar to Sethos, has some very, very high theoretical damage. Tighnari Yai teams, very, very impressive. Is a bit difficult to play for most players, and he has literally no AoE, which definitely holds him back. On top of that, as most of the meta has shifted and gotten better and gone up, spread and aggravate have stayed the same. And so while I did have him in tier 2 previously, he just hasn't gotten any new tools, and it's kept him in tier 3, but I do think there is potential in the future for him. Ganyu got some new melt stuff in the form of Mawika, and Xilonen also helped as well. Mawika not needing to battery energy is absolutely huge for Ganyu. So if you are an absolute madman and you can not need a shield to play with Ganyu, you could absolutely argue moving her up. But I think for most people, tier 3 is where she belongs. Mono Cryo and Freeze have definitely fallen off right now. But I think if we get an actual melt support for cryo characters, ideally one that provides some interruption resistance, I could see Ganyu going up for sure. Sino is another victim of the trend that Genshin just hasn't released very much in the way of the Sumeru cast of characters. The Dendro reactions just aren't as high of a ceiling as they used to be. Sino is also notoriously difficult to play, either having ER issues if used with Baiju or survivability issues if used with Kuki. Obviously, Furina and Nahida are good for him, but Nahida not allowing multi-wave. Overall, Sino's damage just not being quite where it needs to be a higher character. Still viable, but not higher than tier 3. I'm often called a fake yoimiya simp because I'm in love with yoimiya, almost literally. No, but she has one of my favorite designs and my favorite personality in the entire game. I love, love, love yoimiya, but her kit is bad, guys. She doesn't have any AoE at all. Her damage is just not that high. And yes, she did get a buff with Citlali. I really did consider putting her in tier 2. I had her in tier 2 for a long time, as I did some other characters here. But I had yoimiya in tier 2, and unfortunately, I can't justify her being any higher than this. She, in particular, also suffers with the constrictions that we've put on this tier list, where we're considering either their signature weapon or their Constellation 1, and her weapon just isn't that great for her. Her Constellation 1 isn't very good for her, so that even further holds her down. But in abysses such as the one we're currently in, where it's mostly single target, she can clear, but as soon as we add any semblance of AoE, then she really, really struggles. Ito, another Inazuma character sort of left behind. Different from yoimiya, he really needs his weapon and he really wants high investment stuff. If you go expensive for Ito and you give him his weapon, maybe a Constellation or two, maybe Xilonen C2, he's absolutely moving up the tier list. But as is, his best team is Furina, Yelan, Xilonen. I know it's weird, it doesn't even include C6 Goro. But the thing that people don't talk about with Ito is he's actually kind of hard to play. To get really good clears, you actually have to min-max his combos pretty consistently. And so dedicated, invested Ito mains, you can push this character higher on the tier list. But I want to make this tier list at least informative of the power level to the general player base, and most people are going to experience Ito as a tier 3 character. We all know Ayato has mostly been considered to be power crept. He still has some viable stuff. Farina Bennett Kazuha, pretty good in AoE, honestly. I can clear with Ayato, I like him, but his lower multipliers and his really short field time definitely holds him back from being better. His brother-in-arms, Tartaglia, is also in tier 3. I know. International was amazing for so long, but it isn't 2021 anymore. His Riptides was crazy when the quadratic scaling hit so many enemies, but these scenarios just don't happen very much anymore. If you're an absolute sweaty meta tryhard with Tartaglia, you can still push him up to being a tier 2, maybe even higher character, but the majority of people are not going to be able to do that. His rotations are difficult, his energy is difficult, his survivability is difficult, and he only has one viable team, so he sticks to tier 3. This tier list isn't technically ordered, but I do kind of have Yoimiya at the top of tier 3. She's a reasonably good aggravate carry and a reasonably good Chevreuse carry, but I find her to have a lot more value and a lot more strength in the off-field section. So I have her quite a bit higher in the off-field section. So before Yoimiya mains hate me, just know that this is what I think of her on-field playstyle, which is clunky, annoying. She doesn't do that much with her normal attacks. Like, let's be real, her on-field presence is just not there. But her off-field, I think, is really underrated. So don't get mad at me yet, Yoimiya mains. I think she's a good character. She's just more of an off-field character. Yao Yao provides Dendro and she heals. Again, aggravate, not as great as it once was, and that's the main use for her. Nilou, not as great as she once was, but still reasonably fine. Candace, I don't have her constellation labeled here because if you have her at C6, she's great for Arlecchino. If you have her at C0, she's good for Mualani. Candace is a pretty fun character, and I think it's great that she started from the bottom and now she's here. I don't think she contributes enough to go any higher, but I think she's a pretty solid unit. If Yunjin had some off-field Geo and she could apply Crystallize from off-field, she'd be a pretty consistent enabler of Geo Resonance with Shalonen teams for normal attack characters. As is, it's a bit clunky and a bit annoying, but it's still not bad. It's a lot better than I think Yunjin was before. I don't mind her with Arlecchino. I don't mind her with Mualani even. I don't mind her with Clorand with Shalonen. Like, Yunjin's actually a decently viable support. Sayu, kind of like Budget Jean, good VV healer for Farina. You can do some on-field stuff, pretty fine. Barbara applies Hydro, healing, kind of Farina driver kind of stuff, Nilou kind of stuff, but overall, not that crazy. Kind of want to do... Actually, does Barbara go down? Whatever. I don't know. Barbara might go down. Lisa has some pretty nifty supportive potential. Her burst defense shred, electro application. She can be used on some Novelette teams. She can do aggravate driver stuff. Lisa. Beidou provides some defensive utility, some off-field damage. The thing that holds her back from being higher is number 1, her huge energy needs. And number 2, her damage is only good when there's 2 to 3 targets. If you only have 1 enemy, it's kind of really bad, and if you have more than 4 enemies, it's kind of really bad, so this is where Beidou goes. Kale provides a small EM buff at C4. She provides a decent amount of Dendro. You can use aggravate without a defensive Dendro now because of Shalonen. She can hold Elegy, although we're not really considering that here, but she can do instructors and stuff like that, so yeah, she's decent. Lynette can be a viable driver at C6. She's a viable off-field DPS in Faruzan with a bit of defensive utility. Lynette. Goro provides a pretty solid buff, but it's not enough to even beat Ito's or Noelle's best in slot team anymore. So for that reason, I can't really put him any higher. If we get some better Geo characters, I could see him moving up. Layla provides a shield, some cryo application, some off-field damage, a little bit of buffing. Not a bad character, but not that impactful either. Mika provides some healing, attack speed. Unfortunately, physical's just in a bad spot. He's got some other stuff with Farina teams and healing, like Wanderer and different stuff you can do. I could definitely see him getting better in the future when we get more physical characters, but for now, Mika's right here. How the Mighty Have Fallen. The absolute most broken character on Genshin Impact release is now tier 3. That's crazy. His grouping is basically totally unnecessary for the past multiple years of the Abyss, and only providing a small energy refund and Viridescent just isn't enough to be any higher than this. Finally, Sigewinne, and no, I'm not saying Sigewinne is higher than Venti. This is not ordered. Sigewinne's best as sort of an off-field buffer of Farina. I've seen some Sigewinne Klee things. I tried it out myself, couldn't really get it to work, but she's also got her mono hydro stuff, which definitely fell off after Shalonen. The standard for healers is just much higher. So this is where Sigewinne goes. All right, this is what the tier list looks like so far. We finished up with our Madman line, our viable-ish if you work hard line, our carried but viable line. Now we're going into like true mid. It doesn't even have a label because med is talking about above and carried but viable is talking about below. So I would call this like true mid. We'll switch it up and we'll start with the supports this time. Kachina provides scroll, which is good. Provides some Geo. It's kind of good for Navia, for Neuvillette, and it's like an alright core with Chiori. Keqing is pretty good. Kaya can solo melt enable Arlecchino at C6. He can also be a secondary melt enabler with C-Lali teams. He can be a melt enabler for Moika. Charlotte, a healer for Farina teams, particularly Neuvillette, can also enable melt, and if you build enough into her ER and artifacts, she can pass Thrilling Tales to Moika, Arlecchino, etc. as well. Kirara can hold the key if you happen to have it. Otherwise, she can hold Sapwood Blade, Instructors. I hate Sapwood Blade, by the way. And she is definitely the best aggravate buffer with providing consistent off-field Dendro replication and the shield. I really like Kirara with Shalonen for Cloran teams, but that's kind of the only team that I really like with Kirara, so she stays right here. Rosaria, basically the same thing as Kaya. You get a little crit rate buff, but you're more constrained to circle impact. Kujo Sara, pretty locked to Raiden and Clorand, and also isn't really the best in slot with them either, but she's still a great buffer for them, so she goes right here. Raiden as an off-fielder goes right here. I know people like to do Hyper Bloom with Raiden. I know you can use her as like an off-field electro applier for Neuvillette or for Overload Arlecchino. You can use Tenacity with that. There's some stuff you can do. It's totally sacrilegious, but it's all right. Komi, good for Nilou, Mono Hydro. I have her in the same spot, on field and off field. Line's kind of blurred with Kokomi. Also got Burgeon stuff, I guess, but mostly it's Mono Hydro. She's also got Freeze for off field. Not that Freeze is particularly high, but I think for the variety of stuff that she's got going on, Kokomi goes here. Dea, despite the hate, is still a reasonably good support. Good for on-field Neuvillette. Clorand Overload. One of her best uses is for Kinich, holding Deepwood, providing off-field interruption resistance, a variety of supportive artifact sets, and off-field pyro application. Dea is pretty solid, actually. A big fall from grace is Baiju. I used to use Baiju all the time. I just don't anymore. But he's still solid. He still gives a lot of healing. I love his refreshing shield. It's great for interruption resistance. He can still be a Hyper Bloom driver, although he's not ideal since you have to be such close range. And of course, he's arguably the premier overall off-field aggravate guy. I prefer Kirara, but I think most people prefer Baiju. But it's just buffs aren't that big. So outside of providing Dendro and being a healer, it's just not that big. He can still go for Neuvillette, so he's got that going for him. Overall, definitely not a bad character, but definitely not at the heights he once was. Shenhe has some pretty alright usages on Ayaka teams, obviously, but also now Chaska teams. And you can kind of cope with her hold skill buffing Moika's charge attacks for some melts. Overall, Shenhe is pretty solid. Not quite the glow up that I was hoping for, but definitely a glow up nonetheless. I feel like Albedo is a pretty underrated unit these days. Pairing him up with Shalonen, he does really solid damage. His EM buff is actually useful on a number of teams, be they Mualani or Arlecchino teams. And I just think he's a pretty solid off-fielder. He still does have the huge issue of his summons getting destroyed. And of course, there's usually better things you can do, but he's still pretty solid. Nilou is definitely not the powerhouse she once was. Not only is AoE very limited in the Abyss for the last long time, or at least the types of AoE that Nilou is good for, she hasn't gotten any new characters that directly synergize with her kit. She sort of wants, well, there's a lot of stuff that could happen that could really buff her teams, but she hasn't gotten it. She basically carries the teams into building weird stats on their back, and they don't have like any inherent synergy. She has a hard time building teams that can deal with elemental shields, a lot of them. This Abyss is a great example. And overall, there's just too many times where Nilou teams don't feel good, as she is kind of more treated like a DPS in the way that you invest and build around her teams. I have given her her weapon, whereas most of the other supports are using a 4-star weapon. If you don't have her weapon, she probably falls down another tier, as her weapon can enable a lot more EM sharing, so you can run Farina on her teams and have her actually deal respectable single target damage while doing blooms. Same with like Neuvillette kind of stuff that can kind of carry those teams through the problematic chambers. So they could fix Nilou anytime they want by giving her a dedicated 5-star support or a dedicated 4-star support, but they just have chosen not to yet. Who knows if they will, but I hope they do. And finally, Jean. Once again, this is not ordered within tiers, but Jean, obviously team-wide healer for Farina. Vivi, what more do you want me to say? Jean's pretty good. Moving over to tier 2 for DPSs. Below the line, we have nobody. Yes, that's right. We have very, very few tier 2 DPSs. The first one, I already spoiled it for you. It's Kokomi. It's mostly mono hydro. It's pretty darn good. It's very comfy. Kokomi. Klee. Just a bit better than her other pyro brethren, Yanfei and Yoimiya. Klee has AoE, She has lots of pyro application for enabling some off-field Farina stuff, and although she's very annoying to play, she does actually have the tools in her kit and the multipliers that make her still a pretty good character. And I know that nobody will believe me because nobody has Klee, but it's true, and that's what you pay me for, the truth. Ayaka. Dedicated Ayaka mains are absolutely crazy. You can see some really cool clears with Ayaka, and even if you're not dedicated, she can still do it. She's got good multipliers. Shenhe helps her quite a bit. Yeah, freeze sucks. Yeah, she's a bit of reset impact, but she can still get the job done and a noticeably bit better than the likes of Ganyu. Still doesn't achieve the heights of Wriothesley, but she makes it to tier 2. Fandango Man is pretty alright. A lot of characters got buffed by Shenhe. Wanderer was not one of those characters. He hasn't gotten a buff in a while, and so he's kind of chilling here, kind of being carried by Faruzan. He's got some pretty good AoE, some pretty good multi-wave, pretty good versatility considering you can run shield or no shield, pretty good multipliers. Wanderer. And Xiao. I do think Xiao, I'm not ordering these, but I do think Xiao is the best in this tier. Xiao is another character that if you pay, you can win more. If you get Shanyun signature weapon, if you get Shanyun Constellation 2, and that's on top of already having Zhao's signature weapon and Faruzan C6, you can see Zhao stonks start to rise, and I've seen some pretty nutty clears when you get a higher constellation Shanyun, but because we're just considering a little bit of vertical investment, he needs to stay at tier 2. It's only if you include more vertical investment that he can move up, in my opinion. So this is the tier list at this point. Tier 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now we're moving on to tier 1.5. All of the characters from now on are what I would consider meta characters. I know meta stands for most effective tactics available, or sometimes it doesn't, depending on who you ask. But these are like good characters. They're characters that contribute quite a bit, or to quite a variety of teams. I would say that tier 2, they sort of equally carry and get carried, maybe. These characters do a bit more of the carrying, and the higher you go, the more they carry. Once again, still not ordered, we start with Xingqiu. Hydro application, pretty good damage. Interruption resistance, works in Vape, works in Hyperbloom. Xingqiu. He is pushed down a bit by not benefiting from like the stuff Yelan benefits from, but he's still good. Very good. Thoma provides shield, off-field pyro application, damage bonus at C6. I think his C4 is where he needs to be in this tier because it's not the biggest damage bonus, but the C6 does like solidify his position in this tier. But he's great for Clorand Overload. He's even better for Keqing. He's got some other stuff that I can't think of right now. Oh, some Mualani stuff, kinda. Thoma. Diona has received the biggest glow up I've ever seen. Maybe not I've ever seen, but she's received a huge glow up. She gets like most improved sticker for this meta for sure. I have been a Diona hater for a long time because I'm like, what does she do? Sure, she has the EM buff, but who is that for? Screws up, like Ganyu's melts, and that was like the only time you'd use it. It was not good. But now she not only got Chaska, who I actually really like Diona Chaska, but she also got Moika, and she's a great replacement to Shenhe on Moika teams. So you can use Citlali Diona, and she can even replace Citlali. That EM is really, really big for Moika teams and for Arlecchino teams and for Gaming teams. So Diona, most improved. Faruzan carries the animal boys on her back. She is a cracked support. If you were to just look at their kit in a vacuum and what they provide in a vacuum, Faruzan could be tier 1 or maybe even higher. But given that the other Animo characters are not the best DPSs, she's kind of kept to the outside here. Fischl does great off-field damage. She provides energy. She asks for basically no field time, and she works on a wide variety of teams. I don't think she's any higher than this or top 10 or anything like some people do because she doesn't appear on the super top meta teams. I don't think she's best in slot on any teams anymore. Even Clorand would prefer Ororon. So yeah, Fischl, still a great character, really good character, and she belongs in tier 1.5. Kuki. And now here is where I start to make people hate me. Hyperbloom is a tier 1.5 team. If you give it more of a benefit of the doubt and you say, oh, it's so free to play friendly, it requires lower investment, which isn't quite true because you still need really good artifacts on your Alhaitham or your Xingqiu or your Yelan. Yeah, your Kuki can run on full EM, but most of the time there's a support character that can run on easy artifacts. But even if we grant that it's good for low investment, I think Hyperbloom still makes maximum tier 1. And I really like Kuki's kit. She heals and she provides off-field Hyperbloom. Good. But I think Hyperbloom it just hasn't received any tools. And there are teams better than Hyper Bloom by a pretty significant margin these days, given the fact that we are considering C0R1 or C1R0. Even at C0, there are still teams that are significantly better. Hyper Bloom is still a high tier team, but it's only a tier 1.5, maybe tier 1 if you're really generous type of team. I think this is where she belongs. Chiori. I used to be really mad about Chiori's kit and how she basically needs her C1 to be good. If you have her C1, I definitely think she moves up to tier 1 instead of 1.5. I have her C1, but I know that nobody else does, so I'm not considering her C1 for this tier list. I originally wanted to put her up here because and put the C1 tag, but I don't think most people should or will get Chiori C1. So without her C1, she's right here. She's still a pretty good character to pair up with Navia or Shalonin, and that's without activating half of her kit, basically. Maybe one day we'll see more construct characters, and that can push her up higher. But for now, she's just a solid character that most people should skip, but she's still solid. Pyro Traveler. You thought I forgot about Pyro Traveler, didn't you? He's like a mini Moika. He has a pretty big nuke that can be melted, and he also provides off-field pyro application. Even though it's scuffed because it has low uptime, you can run Sack Sword to help. But he also provides the scroll, and off-field pyro application plus scroll is plus a decent nuke is a pretty lethal combination. Pyro Traveler, not bad. Pretty good. Yoimiya. As an off-field unit, I think Yoimiya is pretty good. I do think Fischl is better. Again, this is not ordered. I've sort of just got all the 5 stars in a row and then all the 4 stars in a row. But often, Yoimiya won't be worse than Fischl. Often, they'll be fairly similar. And if you do have some AoE, if you do have some multi-wave, and if you can spare the field time, sometimes Yoimiya is better than Fischl. So overall, I think she belongs in the same tier as Fischl anyways. And I think she's pretty good. Mona is another character who has had a massive glow up. And I didn't list this down below, but I am absolutely considering C1 for standard banner characters because I think it's very reasonable to think that you'll lose 150-50 to Mona and that you can get her C1 from the standard banner selector that we have every year, or you can play for 2 years and get her C1 guaranteed that way. Mona's C1 really helps her vaporize stuff. She's great with Arlecchino. She's great with Mualani. She can be used with so many other teams as well. She can run instructors. She can run tenacity. I don't know if you actually do that because, well, we can run with Arlecchino, but she can hold Thrilling Tales, and the Omen buff is just really big. And some teams don't want to use Farina because they don't want the Hydra application or they don't synergize with the healing. So Mona, pretty good character actually. Shen Yun carries the plunge meta, of course, which isn't like crazy strong, but it is tier 1.5 strong. And she can also be a healer in a pinch for Farina, but mostly she carries the plunge meta. Zhongli, a little bit lower than I would like to put him. So here's the struggle. People still use Zhongli. People still like Zhongli. I think Lanyan is a better character because she can hold Thrilling Tales. This is a meta tier list, but Zhongli is very comfy. If people still use Zhongli, it's very tough. I don't really find myself ever using Zhongli. I don't prefer him in Neuvillette anymore. I don't prefer him in Arlecchino anymore. I don't prefer him with Linny anymore. I don't prefer him with anyone, really. His pillar is very unreliable. Sometimes it summons under the enemy so that you can't get your tenacity buff consistently. Using Archaic Petra with him is very annoying. It's okay in Neuvillette teams, but it can still be very annoying to run after it. He still is very comfy. I rated him very highly in my casual friendly tier list, but I think for a meta tier list, I think tier 1.5 is where he needs to go. I do appreciate though that his shield is very comfy and that's what keeps him in 1.5. He's not on any top teams, but he's still a pretty solid character. I'm actually going to be canceled for this. I'm going to have Reddit threads about me for this. I thought about putting Nahida in tier 1 just because I know the internet will be very unhappy with this. But Hyper Bloom is a tier 1.5 team. It's if you assume low investment, again, this, if we were to go C0, R0, then I think I would put Nahida in tier 1 because the Dendro teams don't really benefit all that much from 5-star weapons or from constellations unless you get Nahida C2. If you're doing Nahida C2, you can absolutely move her up for sure. Hyper Bloom is still a good team, but it isn't a top meta team. It isn't a super high meta team. It is a solidly meta team. And I do think she is at the top of tier 1.5. Even though this is not ordered. So if we look at usage rates, Nahida's most used team is actually a Cloran team. Wow. And this is not even close to Cloran's best team. Not even close. and that's her most used team. Second most used team is Ororon, Hyperbloom, Fischl Hyperbloom, Xiangling Hyperbloom, Double Hydro, Respect, Alhaitham, Kinich using Nahida. Emily's obviously way better here. Moeka Hyperbloom? I just don't think that Nahida enables enough top stuff to be any higher than the top of 1.5. I think people will come around to this way of thinking. And again, if you consider no constellation or 5-star weapon investment, I think you can make the argument for tier 1. Perhaps. But even still, I would hesitate to actually make that claim because I just don't think she contributes enough to enough top teams. If you look at what her actual kit does, she applies a lot of Dendro, she buffs some EM to the on-field character only, and she has poor multi-wave performance because her skill doesn't reapply to new enemies. Tier 1.5 DPSs. Gaming. If you're a filthy min-maxer, I could see him going up. His melt teams are quite good. I think most people are going to find that his performance is about right here. Plunge Diluc trades some of the peak potential of Gaming for ease of use and a bit more consistency. Yes, Plunge Diluc is better than Zhao. I'm sorry. Linny, another character with really, really high peaks, could possibly go up if you're godlike with Linny, or maybe if you have C1 or C2 along with his weapon. But Linny, he wasn't buffed as much by Melt as some other characters, but he's still a great DPS. He has... Citlali is nice for a shielded team, so he's a bit more consistent with that than he might have been previously, but overall I think this is where he belongs. Alhaitham is the premier Hyperbloom character, and I think Hyperbloom is a tier 1.5 team. I had some PvP with people who disagreed with me because I think that the tier 1 teams just perform a lot better than the Alhaitham teams. And based on damage numbers, based on clear times, this is what we decided. Alhaitham in 1.5 along with Hyperbloom. Yelan as an on-fielder in Mono Hydro is actually pretty good. You use Shilonin, Farina, Kazuha to buff her, and she buffs herself. It's pretty good. And yeah, you're using her as an on-fielder because she's buffing herself with her own burst. Wriothesley Melt got a pretty big glow up with both Shilonin and Moeka. You can either run him as the guy who's melting or with off-field Moeka melting. That one's a bit more scuffed, but a bit better. So Wriothesley. Raiden as an on-fielder is really, really comfortable and provides a lot of ER for Yelan and Farina to build a lot more damage. She's also pretty good on Chevreuse. If you add some more 5-star weapons and or constellations for Yelan and Farina, she could be considered even higher as she's just a really nice driver. But at the investment level we're working with, she goes here. And finally, our cute little Hu Tao. I love this skin, by the way. She goes in tier 1.5. You're probably looking at C1 as opposed to R1 with her right here, or you can consider R1 with Plunge. She really kind of wants both, but we're just going to consider one. She can do some Citlali stuff, but I think Farina, Yelan, Shilonin is still overall her best. Although correct me if I'm wrong. She's got a wide variety of solid teams that hit pretty darn hard. Doesn't hit quite as hard as some of the stuff in tier 1, especially given the mechanics required to do it. So I think she sits comfortably in tier 1.5. This is our tier list moving into tier 1 and tier 0. Starting with supports, we have Sucrose. Thrilling Tales, EM, VV buff, it's very strong. Especially in the Melt Vape meta we have right now, Sucrose is doing well. Xiangling, despite all of us wanting to ditch her, is still a very good off-field DPS. Pyro Applicator absolutely needs her C4 to function, but Xiangling still performs very well on a wide variety of teams, whether it be stuff with Bennett, whether it be stuff with Chevreuse, whether it be Mualani stuff, Kinich, whether it be Navia, whether it be Chaska. Xiangling is still a very meta-relevant character. Oron with C6, giving the attack buff, holding the scroll, doing similar off-field damage to Fischl, a little bit worse, but better in AoE. Ororon is a great character. Obviously, he's used a lot in this particular abyss, and so even at C0, in this abyss, he makes tier 1, but I think moving forward for other abysses where Natlan shield breaking isn't as important, I think at C6 he'll still stay at this level. He's still good for Chaska, he's still great for Chlorand, he's still great for Moeka, he's great for Electrocharge. Ororon. Yelan definitely falling off compared to the heights she once was. I once considered her possibly the best character in the game. Now she is just very, very solid. Vape isn't as top of meta. Everything is Melt now, but she's still very flexible, still very good with Arlecchino, still very good with Farina Shilonin as a core, still very good with Hyperbloom. Yelan is still a very good character. Moeka as an off-fielder. She does good off-field damage. She has the scroll if the team supports that, or you can just run her on DPS. You can run her as a dual DPS, sub DPS, although the more we get into dual DPS territory, then she moves over to the other side for the on-fielder. So we're mostly considering her off-field potential. It's kind of muddy with Moika, but she's still a pretty good off-field character. Very good. Kazuha. I got a lot of heat for saying that Kazuha is not a tier 0 character, that he's a bit worse than Lan Yan right now. Just hear me clearly. If grouping ever becomes important again, he'll be tier 0 because he is the best grouper in the game. That is one of the things that made him tier 0 before. But now he's no longer the best buffer, and grouping is not as important. So where does that put him? It makes him worse than he was. We haven't needed grouping in the Abyss for over a year, and there doesn't seem to be any sign that it's going to be coming back. But if it does, Kazuha's moving up. As it is, Viridus Inventor uptime falls off very, very quickly. Yes, you can refresh his damage bonus with his burst off field, but VV is a very important part of his buffing, and the fact that it falls off so quickly compared to things like Shalonen keep him down here, as well as he just doesn't buff as much as Sucrose and Lan Yan, so his grouping utility just isn't enough to prop him up into tier 0, but if it ever comes back, then he absolutely will be tier 0 again. Lan Yan C4, just a bit higher than Kazuha because of the meta right now. I consider Thrilling Tales plus 60 EM plus a shield to be more impactful to teams and to contribute more to stronger teams than either Sucrose's giving 80 to 100 more EM. I would think a shield is going to be better for most people than that, than 60 to 80 EM, or sorry, 80 to 100 EM more for Sucrose. Lan Yan gives 60. And I think it's more than Kazuha's, 38 to 440 damage bonus. And the grouping, again, if grouping comes back, Kazuha moves up. As it is, Lan Yan is just slightly the better character for now. Emily just does an absolute crap ton of damage. She is a very competitive option for a ton of pyro teams. Emily is ridiculously strong. If someone's applying pyro, Emily does amazing off-field damage, and it's unconditional as long as pyro is happening. There's no setups, there's no swirling, there's nothing. You just put her skill there. It's like Fischl, but twice as much damage. It's insane. Emily is insane. And if you get her weapon, it's even more insane. And the top of tier 1 for off-fielders is Chevreuse. She does need her C6 to be here, just as Lan Yan needs her C4, etc. If you don't have her C6, she absolutely goes down a tier. But at C6, Cloran teams, Arlecchino teams, these are some of the top teams in the meta. The fact that her buff works in multi-wave, it applies to all of the units on the field, regardless of whether she tags them or not. Like Animo characters, you need to tag all the enemies on the field to get the shred. But no, she provides crit damage, damage percent, and resistance shred, and attack buff, and healing. It's an absolute ridiculous buff. Chevreuse is crazy. Moving over to the tier 1 DPSs, we start with Keqing. Now, I'm not considering Moika dual DPS for this tier list. If you did, things would get very scuffed very quickly, because Keqich's best clearing team, Keqing has great teams, but his best clearing team includes Bennett, Citlali, Moika, because Moika can just get that huge nuke buffed by Bennett. She can get some melts in her charge attacks, and then you do switch to Keqing for some extra damage. I know it sounds goofy and ridiculous, and that's because it is. And so to keep things even, we're not considering Moika dual DPS because it just screws up the meta so much. Moika is so broken that if you start considering Moika dual DPS, things get very silly. So Keqing on his own merits belongs here. Great burning damage. It's a little bit annoying to move into his Dorito triangle to keep his uptime. But he works great with Emily. He works great with Pyro Traveler as a substitute. He does work great with Moika, even if you don't use the Citlali stupid thing. But he also works great with comfy characters like Toma or Dea. Great single target, serviceable AoE, fun and smooth to play. And yeah, I think he's just a cut above. But keep in mind, tier 1 and tier 1.5, they're 1 and 1.5 for a reason, right? They're pretty close. Same with the supports. They're pretty close. They're not a whole tier away. They're only half a tier away, right? Mualani has some of the highest peaks in the game. If you play Reset Impact, if you play versus the right content, Mualani can absolutely be even a tier 0 DPS, possibly. But considering the inconsistencies, considering how many enemies don't like her, she belongs in tier 1, but her damage is crazy. Yeah. Chaska is arguably the biggest offender of the Moika dual DPS thing, as she already wants to run Citlali and Bennett, so running Moika in that team does make sense. But again, then it's kind of like you just want to stay on with Moika. So we look at Chaska's other teams, whether they be Citlali, Bennett, Xiangling, Citlali, Bennett, Farina, Auroron, etc. Chaska. She's pretty strong. She definitely doesn't have the peaks of Mualani, but she's also so ridiculously easy and consistent to play. And she did get a big buff through Citlali, and she's still good with Shenhe, etc. I talked about Navia at length in my top 5 DPS video. All those things still apply, but if you don't consider Moika dual DPS stuff, which I felt it was only fair to, even though you don't do the Citlali stuff, is it really fair to consider Moika Navia dual DPS? I don't know. It's very scuffed. This meta is very scuffed, and I'm sorry. But Navia is still a great character. She's still consistent, she's easy to play, and she can get great clears with lots of different teams, especially with Xilonen. I know I'm fully canceled, but hopefully some of you are starting to get Clorand and her weapon, or her C1, I guess, and C6 Chevreuse, and you can see that she's actually crazy strong. I'm just getting toasted all over Reddit, all over the comments. I used to like Jello until he said that Clorand is a top 5 DPS. Well, she is a top 5 DPS. Clorand also has excellent team versatility, working well with Overload, Electrocharge, and Aggravate, and also being able to work okay with Hyperbloom. For Hyperbloom teams, in my testing, do perform a lot better than the Alhaitham Hyperbloom teams. You can put Alhaitham and Clorand in exactly the same team, and in my experience, Clorand will perform better, even though that's not even close to her best team. Using Overload not only gives her great AoE, multi-wave, and single target performance, it also doesn't take very many valuable resources. It doesn't take Xilonen, it doesn't take Farina, doesn't even take Bennett. All of those characters are free for the other side, and in practice, she clears better than all the other DPSs that I have listed so far. So for all those reasons, Clorand goes right here. The only exception is, again, if Navia, Chaska, Kinich use Moika as a very prominent sub DPS, because although that does help Clorand, using Moika as a prominent sub DPS on Chevreuse teams, that does help her. It helps Chaska and Kinich and to some extent Mualani more, because you can run them with Citlali and then vape Moika's hit, and then those teams can outperform Clorand. But I just think that that's a little bit hokey, and at that point, just run Diona instead of Chaska, Kinich, and you'll get better results. So doesn't really count as a Chaska team or a Kinich team, in my opinion. Anyone who disagrees with that, message me on Discord and we'll personally debate this, because if I'm wrong, I want to move her down. Look, my favorite characters that I simp the hardest for are yoimiya, Shenhe, Raiden, Hu Tao, Mualani, and Clorand. One of the things that makes me simp for characters is because they're strong. If I thought yoimiya was actually strong, I'd be talking about her being strong. If I thought that Clorand was weak, I would be complaining about her being weak, just like I complain about yoimiya being weak. I don't just yap about characters that I think are strong because I like them, I actually test them. And my Clorand gets crazy clears, so therefore I think she's strong. It has nothing to do with the fact that I really like the character. I think that Arlecchino is a tiny cut above the other characters here. Kind of makes me want to do something like this. I think she's still a tier 1 character because I think she's below the tier 0 characters, but I do think personally that her melt teams are ridiculous. In Vape and other teams, I think she's more in line with these other ones, but her melt with Citlali is insane. So I think it's kind of more like this is a better visual of what I think about this tier. I don't think she's tier 0, but I do think she is noticeably better than the other characters. She also has great flexibility. She's also great with Chevreuse. Arlecchino is crazy. This is the tier list going into tier 0. Farina. Actually, let's just rip the band-aid off. These are the top 4 tier 0 supports, off-fielders. Farina is absolutely nuts. Still one of the biggest buffers in the game, and amazing off-field damage, and providing a very useful element in Hydro. I no longer think she's the best character in the game, but she is very strong, and this is ordered. Citlali contributes to what I would consider the best team in the game. And I think we should almost talk about it all together. These are obviously the tier 0 DPSs. So look, Moika, Xilonen, Bennett, Citlali is by far the best team in the game, and it's not close. And if you don't believe me, look at calcs, look at clear times, fight me on Discord. It dumpsters absolutely everything. And Moika doesn't even get the buff on the top side, and she still outclears Arlecchino, even with the 75% damage bonus going to Arlecchino. That's crazy. And you don't have to have Xilonen and Citlali for Moika to be the best character in the game. Moika can clear just with Bennett, Citlali, and Diona, or another Cryo, and it'll still outclear Arlecchino's best team, or any of the other DPS's best team. It's so bad that Moika, Bennett, Citlali, plus any DPS is basically that DPS's best team. Like the 3-man core is it's the new Hyperbloom. except that it's on a league that Hyperbloom never even saw coming. Like, it's nuts. Neuvillette is here because obviously he's very, very easy to play and very, very comfy and has amazing AoE. But also he does amazing damage, especially if you min-max my assumptions here, which are you can give him, you know, the 4-star Battle Pass R1 weapon and give him his C1, and then, you know, his damage is also really crazy. So Neuvillette, you know, the second best DPS in the game, I think by a pretty good margin. And then on this side, Bennett is just so impactful on so many teams. Moika absolutely wants Bennett. Arlecchino, Navia, Chaska, Kinich, so many characters want Bennett. He makes such a huge difference to your teams. Citlali just created the melt archetype, taking Moika and Arlecchino to absolutely absurd heights. And of course, Xilonen is, in my opinion, the best character in the game. She gives an absolutely unconditional resistance shred. Yeah, sometimes it can be hard to get the double crystallize, but often it isn't, and often you don't need it, even if it is. So resistance shred, the damage bonus from the scroll set, and healing. So you can run either with Farina or just have extra healing. If you already have a scroll user, she can use Petra really easily. Unlike Zhongli Petra, I find Xilonen with Petra way less cringe because you can easily skate after the crystallized shard and pick it up. So she basically is a character with the best buffs in the game. They work in multi-wave, and she really doesn't have any downside. And it lasts way longer than Viridescent Venerer. So your character's full rotation is buffed instead of the first 2/3 or so. So Xilonen is absolutely broken. And yeah, top tier DPSs are Neuvillette, and the best DPS in the game is Moika. I don't know how I would do like a top 10. You know, is Moika better than Bennett? I have no idea. I think Xilonen is the best character in the game. Other than that, who knows? I could see an argument for Bennett as well. So I think I should probably be Xilonen, then Bennett, then either Moika or Citlali, then the other one, then Farina, then Neuvillette. Maybe, but maybe Neuvillette then Farina, because a lot of Neuvillette teams don't even have to have Farina anymore with Moika. So this is the list. As I said, it'll be available on Tactor, and if any of you Discord warriors want to message me, I am down to defend my takes, and if I am wrong, I want to be right. So if I'm wrong, either if you disagree with my criteria, or if you disagree with my tier list based on my criteria, we can talk about that, and I'll keep my Tactor list updated. Remember to go enter on Tactor to win a free character of your choice, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And if you don't want to do any of that, that is totally fine. Just watching the video has been more than enough. Thanks so much. Bye for now. I know a number of people feel that Moika being locked to Natlin units is a really big detractor, and I just don't agree. First of all, she only needs one Natlin unit to outperform any other DPS in the game by a large margin, and it's not even one specific Natlin unit. Either Xilonen or Citlali will allow Moika to outperform any other DPS, and that is in virtually all scenarios with very good ease of use, very good survivability, and I don't think needing one other unit really makes you that much worse, to be honest. Like, sure, if you want to get the most out of your Moika, you should be getting one of those two characters. Ideally Citlali, but either one will do, or both. But most characters in the game need another unit, or highly prefer another unit to perform best in their optimal teams. And it's not like Moika performs badly, you know, in Overload with Auroron. She doesn't even perform badly with Kachina. You can use Kachina, Diona, Bennett, still melt your first hit, still do crazy damage. Yeah, Moika really is that good. So this is the list. As I said, it'll be available on Tactor, and if any of you Discord warriors want to message me, I am down to defend my takes, and if I am wrong, I want to be right. So if I'm wrong, either if you disagree with my criteria, or if you disagree with my tier list based on my criteria, we can talk about that, and I'll keep my Tactor list updated. Remember to go enter on Tactor to win a free character of your choice, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And if you don't want to do any of that, that is totally fine. Just watching the video has been more than enough. Thanks so much. Bye for now.